Thank you so much for doing this. I'm like so grateful to have your time.
Oh,
Um,
I mean, this is my favorite subject, so,
yeah,
happy to work through it. And it's funny because my understanding does evolve, I feel. So you might get a different version of what's going on than maybe a year ago. So let's do it.
yeah. Okay, let's do it. Okay, you guys. Today we're going to be sitting down. We are sitting down with Sarah Berman. She is an investigative journalist who is based in Vancouver. She covers crime, drugs, politics, and cults, which is what we're going to be chatting about today. You used to be a senior editor at Vice. She's also written this book, Don't Call It a Cult. The shocking story of Kieth Raniere and the Women of NXIVM. She was also on the Netflix documentary Escaping Twin Flames, which is about another cult, the Twin Flames universe. So you are just very versed in all things cult. I think that so many people find cults so fascinating. But I also, before we even start talking about them, I was like, oh, I really just want to acknowledge that like so many people's lives and families' lives have been forever altered and some have been destroyed by cults. And so I just don't want anyone to feel like I'm speaking about it in flippant terms or not respecting the fact that a lot of people actually suffer like enormous traumas that they'll be sorting through the rest of their lives. So it just felt like I needed to say that. And I'm sure obviously you feel the same.
Absolutely. Yes. That's part of why, I think all of us, look to these stories is because we have our own traumas that we're kind of trying to sort out. And
Yeah.
um, but yes, it's, much respect to anyone who opens up about, these types of things. It's
Yeah.
not easy. Sometimes it takes decades, to get to a place where that's possible. And so, yeah, I'm just very grateful for anyone who is willing to share that type of experience because I know it's so vulnerable and so scary.
For sure. For sure. So I thought that we could use mostly Nexium and the Twin Flames universe kind of as like the backdrop for which we speak about cults today, just because I know that you've researched them a lot. It's what I've read the most about and watched the most about in preparation for today and just recent history that I've been focused on. But if you had to give people just like a little backstory, just a few sentences about Nexium, what would you say about that? What would you say about the Twin Flames universe?
Right. So Nexium presented as a self-help group, some classes that you could take to better your confidence, better your career, better your everything success in life.
Yeah.
Of course, it was a charismatic leader who claimed to have a 100 and or no, it was 240 IQ. I love that I've had enough space that I forgot the silly number. He, for his entire life, way before Nexium existed, was, manipulating and controlling women. And so this systematic control and exploitation of young women was always in the background. And this self-help group was essentially created to farm a student group into those needs. And we found out, the true extent of it when, this secret society within Nexium was revealed, where they were branding women, they were pledging to be slaves for eternity. Yeah, just really scary stuff. If you understand it as this system of control, it starts to make sense. It just is one of the more out there, I suppose, stories. And Twin Flames universe presents as, folks trying to find love, supporting each other, in their romantic endeavors. Of course, it also follows this kind of recruitment, multi-level marketing structure. And folks who get wrapped up in it often end up giving half their income, cutting off their families, potentially even changing their identities, sometimes gender identities, sometimes other kinds of identity, just to fit into this group. And so it comes with a whole other style of control. It presents as much softer. I mean, they both present outwardly to the world as, you know, happy. Why would that be a bad thing? But have some darkness inside.
For sure. So if somebody said to you, what makes a cult a cult? Like, what makes something a cult and not just an organization or a club or a religious organization? What really is the distinction?
Yeah, I would say there are probably four like major things. And this is Janja Lalich's work that I most rely on. It's funny because there are many academics with many definitions and models, but this is the one that makes sense to me the most. So you usually have an alive, charismatic leader for whom, nothing can be wrong. You usually have a system of belief. And, of course, religions have systems of belief. All things have systems of belief. But to be able to identify a particularly culty one, usually the answer to every single one of life's questions is always more engagement with the group. Oh, I'm having car trouble, or I need career advice. If the answer is always spend more money in this group, that's usually the sign of a very culty belief system. There's usually some kind of system of control. So it might not be, collateral like you have in NXIVM, but there might be some kind of mini punishment. If you get 20 questions anytime you don't engage, that's usually a system of control. And then a system of influence. So this is more just like, oh man, I want to be with the cool kids, like whether it's sashes or it's some other kind of like symbol of belonging, that's usually a part of it as well. All these things sort of exist on a spectrum. If you see a lot of them, if it's really blatant, chances are it's a worse group.
Okay, so what I think is really interesting and specifically about these two is they both start off as presenting like just self-help organizations, right? Like, and then they evolve into something that appears much more sinister, but their intentions at first kind of seem pure. It's like, hey, you want to be a better version of yourself? Yeah. Or hey, you want to find the love of your life? Great. Like they're appealing to things that people like you and I want in life, right? So I guess my point is it's not like they're starting off right off the bat, like trying to indoctrinate people. And I'm sure that's kind of part of their plan. But like, at what point do we start labeling them a cult? Like, at what point do they become a cult, right? Because it starts off sounding great and then it becomes really scary.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that metaphor about layers of an onion, I feel like just is really relevant. Of course, there's this outer layer to every group that does not look scary whatsoever. You have to have a carrot before the stick, right? Like, so there's always something very appealing. There's always like an answer to a question that you're already asking yourself. Um, and I think that's true of almost every group that I've studied. Sometimes it does evolve into the darker thing later, but often it is inside, it is just among a very small circle. So for Kieth Raniere and NXIVM, that small circle of very indebted, very controlled women existed way back as far as the 80s. They were already doing his bidding in every aspect of his life before NXIVM came to be. And they were essentially workshopping with him because, of course, he always needs to be the center and the charismatic, figure. They were workshopping how essentially to make him a guru.
Yeah. So interesting though how cults now, and these specifically, if and I know that NXIVM is no longer in existence because everybody is in jail as they should be. Um, but the Twin Flames universe, there has been a lot of coverage about their cult status. If you Google them, it literally comes up right away that it is a cult. There are Reddit forums about people expressing their discomfort with it, the fact that it is a cult. It's all over social media, it's everywhere. There's documentaries about it. And even still, they have a massive following. Like as of recently, they had 66,000 friends, I think, on Facebook. They have thousands of followers on Instagram. How does that happen?
Okay, I feel like there's like three parts to
Okay, yeah,
that.
that was a lot. You're right.
I love it. Okay, so one, there are folks who were already in the group, already, super committed, super fans. And the immediate aftermath of, say, a story coming out, the group always works to try and disarm it. So they're saying, oh, we are being persecuted. We're a religious organization. These folks, are experiencing separation from God or, what have you. And so there's always a reason why they're being persecuted and why that's false, And so that keeps the true believers still committed. Um, Two, I feel like there's this sense of exceptionalism, but you know, both in good and bad ways. So some folks who are part of these groups think kind of like you're in a casino, like, oh, all these other people lost, but I'm gonna win, right? Or they think they are so, so bad that even though it's not working for them, even though all the signs point to this being someone else's fault, they think it's their fault, So like
Mhm.
negative exceptionalism, is that a thing? Like, and I think that was exploited in both groups. And then three, I think specifically with the 66,000 followers part, um that is a lot of folks having watched a documentary and really wanting to know what's going on, like really just wanting to hook that story to their veins. Because back when I was reporting on that group, it was about half that number in the group.
Mhm.
And it did tend to go up. Um, and from what I understand, create quite a lot of chaos in that Facebook group.
I'm curious then, who do these cults prey on? Like, is there a specific demographic of people that they seek out to exploit?
Well, yes and no. I feel like anyone can be a person in transition, a person experiencing certain vulnerabilities. Like say I'm just a student and I arrive in a new city. That is a vulnerability. Um, I could still be achieving a lot, well connected, and still have one particular vulnerability. So I don't think like the stereotype of a cult leader with, or sorry, a cult follower with, almost no agency and just doing whatever. I don't think that is true. I think you actually need a lot of willpower to, stick to a specific program in the face of so much resistance. I think a common thing that I just find is trauma. Like a lot of folks have some kind of trauma that they're hoping to heal. And of course, these are very unlicensed, very not in their best interests folks using that trauma. And just because they keep bringing it up, like, this is your trauma, this is your trauma, they think they're getting work done, that they're healing. But in fact, it's being held above their head, and encouraging more engagement. And that's not on them, like, I just want to say that is nobody's fault. If that is being done to you, that is someone else's fault. And yeah, sorry, I get emotional about people, who I care about, who blame themselves for things that they shouldn't need to blame themselves for.
I also think what's really interesting, and especially with NXIVM, there were a lot of very high profile people who got sucked into that cult. Like you had Claire Bronfman, who was the Seagram heir of, the billionaire liquor company. And she had given over $100 million to this organization because she really believed that it could help people. Like that's really fascinating. Like she got 7 years in jail, and from an outside POV, like you wouldn't expect somebody who is that wealthy, who has that much privilege, to get sucked in, and sure enough, she did. Right.
Yeah. Well, and it's because she didn't really have a community and a family that she trusted, like there were rules in her family that she didn't necessarily subscribe to. And so when this other belief system, sort of filled that vacuum, she took resistance as like a sign she was on the right path, right? Like she wanted to bring in her father. She thought that would please Keith Raniere, and so all this sort of uh, inner drama was, built in around the group. And I don't think that was an accident. I do think Keith Raniere in particular was pretty meticulous about, building almost like a trap for people such that they would always be more engaged, more willing to go to war. But yeah, so obviously the ways that people are protected is they have outside influence and, people they can ask questions to, right? So it's, I guess, surprising that, but honestly, it's not surprising that a billionaire heiress wouldn't have that many people to trust and confide in because you're in this like rarefied air. You don't have regular friends. You don't just work at a coffee shop and can say like, "Hey, Sally, what do you think? What does this sound like?" You're not used to the layman's perspective. So, in a sense, it's surprising and not.
So then, if we're thinking about cult leaders, who becomes one? What
Yeah.
demographic, right? Typically men, typically white, right?
Yeah, you've
Um,
got it. You've got it. Usually they are people who have already grown up with a lot of power and control in their hands, and they seem to like it and seem to be able to recreate it. It's funny, narcissist, sociopath, these words are usually ones that come up. And I didn't want to just take someone's word for it. I wanted to kind of try and scientifically test if I could. So, like, I found checklists for these personality traits. And again, I'm not a professional, so don't trust me.
right.
But I wanted to like go through the list, with folks who knew Keith Raniere in particular and like see how many are there. And sure enough, yeah, like you're checking almost every box to the both those checklists. And again, I'm not a professional and I would not, trust me, I'm not a psychologist, but those do seem to be very common profiles. And because they naturally lean that direction, they naturally, you know, influence and control and like create sort of almost punishments in their personal relationships. Their bigger organizations tend to reflect exactly those sort of styles of communication and relationships.
Right. So are those people typically close with their families?
I mean, it's different in every case. I would say Keith Raniere, his mom died when he was young. His dad did still support him, you know. Jeff from Twin Flames Universe, his parents are very unhappy. His family is one cut off, and yeah, two, their relationship is pretty broken. So I can't say that you can predict something like this from necessarily their family life. But yeah, and some people do come about it differently. Like, say you're Charles Manson, he's not necessarily meticulously coming up with a system of life, like Keith Raniere did. Like, Keith Raniere was trying to build a machine. Charles Manson, he had the charismatic magnetism. He was trying stuff randomly, but I don't think the like systematizing elements were there. So it can happen in many ways, but you do need sort of many strikes of lightning for it to truly become a phenomenon.
So that's actually interesting because I was going to ask you that. Do you think that cult leaders like walk into this knowing that they're going to create a cult? Or is it something where it does start off as being these self-help organizations that eventually, once they've realized that there's a following and they are gaining money and power, then it kind of evolves to become something more sinister.
Yeah, I think all of those are options. I don't know. I think they become cults out of a reiterative practice, right? So even Jeff, he had many iterations before Twin Flames universe was a thing. And I would say you could even trace it back to he was like a college pro painter guy, right? And so he had his little circle of college pro painters. It was MLM-esque structure, commission, right? And so his ability to really like get people on board, joining the team, he realized that was something he was good at, you know? And then he finds Shalia, and she has all this like spiritual experience. She has this language that seems to have an exclusivity to it. And they try out like a number of different ways of mixing, business and spirituality. And to say that he had, and it's like, I don't know what's his thoughts and motivations are. I have tried to interview him. I have only gotten email responses. But I would say that there is, yeah, always this ambition within him, like pushing him in this like questionable direction, right? Like, and you can see how he evolves the language. He'll tone it down a little bit if something freaks people out too much, or he'll like try and, go a little further if he gets away with it. Like there's some clues in the iterative process. Same with Kieth Raniere. So he had many iterations before NXIVM became the thing. And even within NXIVM, there were like all these subgroups, that were trying to like latch on to different interests and styles, like even feminism. They wanted like it to be this feminist practice to join NXIVM and put all of your life's work into his group. So like definitely in the case of Keith Raniere, with the use of collateral, like that is a true scheme. Like the racketeering vibe fit. It seemed to be premeditated in a way that often it isn't, because you have your unpremeditated folks who maybe just get further in life, like things seem easy for them. They've got this riz, for lack of a better word, and they just get away with things that probably they shouldn't. Probably somebody should hold them accountable. And if somebody had down the line, they maybe would have corrected their behavior. So yeah, on a spectrum, I would say.
But it does seem with like Keith and Jeff that they both were ambitious people who somehow married this business model with some kind of spirituality that really took off.
Yeah.
And really fast, do you consider Shalia, because obviously Jeff and Shalia Divine, I believe, is their last name of choice in this moment, but do you consider her equal parts cult leader? Because I feel like we do speak about it's mostly men, but she is like by his side, but he still really runs the show, it seems like, from a distance at least.
Yeah, I would say if you watch a lot of the videos, a lot of the interactions are being, run by Jeff, right? You can see a lot of the new business models, where you have to give half your income, or, you can't have outside contact with, say, your family. Like that's usually coming from Jeff. Having spoken to folks who know Shalia, her free spirit energy does not really suggest a controlling personality. But again, I can't speak for what's happening inside their heads. I don't actually know for certain, but yes, I would say Jeff is in the driver's seat, literally and figuratively,
Yeah.
in that case.
Part of me wonders, like when I've watched those videos, I feel like she's often being prompted by Jeff to say something. And I feel like maybe this is not true, but I feel like I see skepticism in her eyes that she's having to push through and saying what she thinks she has to say. I just wouldn't be surprised if in like 5, 10 years she realized that she was a victim in all of this too. Like much like a lot of the women were in NXIVM and kind of forced to, you know, do this thing. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in
Okay.
NXIVM in particular, there was a lot of the Venn diagram was almost a circle between victim and victimizer, you know? So like people who were very victimized were also victimizing others. And that was really hard to wrap a head around. It could very much be that kind of a thing. I think Shalia did disappear from the videos for a brief period when things got a little spicy, but she has, you know, of course, come back into the picture. So take that as a hint if you like. It's unclear exactly what her thoughts and motivations are, but I will say, yes, she speaks less as time goes on. She used to infuse a little bit more of her, you know, perspective and energy in the earlier videos. So taken as a whole, you could probably say her influence has waned and Jeff's has ramped up.
So I think, one of the things that I'm most fascinated by is just how cults work to like dismantle our ability to think for ourselves. So it's as if these cults are slowly and methodically just reworking a person's brain through manipulation, indoctrination, brainwashing, all of these things. So that things that you and I might think are crazy no longer seem so crazy once you've been involved in a cult for weeks, months, years, whatever. So, can we talk about that? Like, what are some of the techniques and methods that these cults use to do that?
Usually there is like a flow chart of engagement that you sort of, as you do it more and more, you just need to do it more and more. It's just like an endless loop, you know, Ouroboros of engagement. In terms of like exposure, it's almost like exposure therapy. You know, you're seeing others do it, you're friends with more people doing it. You're spending less time with the people who think that's kind of weird, you know, so like just the social kind of vibe around you changes and, you know, normalizes a particular behavior. And then again, when you're like deeper into it, um, often there's semi punishment for not engaging, for not putting more money, time, what have you to the group. And you may even be like judged or punished for looking outside the group for assistance or, you know, insight.
Something I thought was so interesting is just their desire to destabilize you and find flaws that weren't necessarily even there. Like there was this quote. Okay, two quick quotes, but you wrote that Raniere told one of his partners that, quote, things are most maneuverable when they are most unstable, end quote. So leads you to believe that like this man wants you to be unstable so he could make you do what he needs to do. But then also, like part of their strategy, you wrote that coaches would often find a way to underline students' flaws, even when they weren't the issues they came in with, and upsell them on the next course. Like, really interesting, right? Just like picking you apart as much as they're trying to build you up, supposedly, they're simultaneously finding flaws to keep you there. I mean, it's very like brilliant, but sick, obviously, but really smart, you know?
It was not slick. I will say this, like in retrospect, you look at even just the intake form and it's like, what is your worst fear? Like what is the most like embarrassing thing that has ever happened to you? And of course, those things were used even by the like lower level folks, you know, to again encourage more engagement. Like, oh, you know, we build you up, we love bomb you, you're so good at these things, but you really need to get over this one trauma that you told us about. Like, that's the key to, you know, whatever thing you're worried about in your own life, this is the key. And by the way, it costs you $7,000 and 2 weeks of your life to do it.
And then the Twin Flames universe did that, like you were saying, the mirroring exercises. And I literally went to their website because I was just curious how they pitch it outside of documentaries that I've watched. But one of the examples is this whole mirroring exercise for people who don't know. It's fascinating because if you say, I am upset with my twin flame because he or she is ignoring me, the goal is to switch the pronouns and change the statement, which then becomes, I am upset with myself because I am ignoring myself. So again, it's devaluing your experience of the world and making it seem as if you are the one with the problem, even if there's no problem to be had. I think that destabilization of making everybody feel like their flaws are inflated and that they have to really figure it out is a thing that helps, or yeah, I think just slowly chips away at your feeling of self-worth and makes you feel more committed to this cult and like sticking it out to fix yourself.
Yeah. I think the like emphasis on inner work, like as if you within yourself can change everything outside, like does leave, there is no accountability on that. There is no actual progress to be documented. And so you can keep somebody in a like just very confused, very like unhappy with themselves, but no one else. Maybe Jeff still is God's gift to this earth in their mind, but they're having a hard time. They're like blaming themselves and they're just like keeping on doing this particular exercise and keeping focused on the Twin Flames universe ideology. It's just like, yes, again, a very destabilized place to live and very hard to come out of.
Something else that's really interesting is just that they silence any feedback that doesn't further their agenda or goes against something that you've been told. And I think that this example that you give is crazy, but you write about this experience where Raniere convinced Barbara Bushi, who was in NXIVM, that maybe she was in fact a quote architect of the Holocaust, and that
In a previous life, yes.
in a previous life, right? And also that Nancy Salzman, who is Jewish, may have been quote Hitler reincarnated. Why he wanted them to believe that is another thing, because that's wild to me too. But these people who might hear that and be like, that's crazy, aren't inclined to speak up, because if they do speak up, they're told that they are disintegrated, right? Is that the right word for it?
Yep.
Right.
I mean, yeah. And
Shame
those
for that.
those facts were really hard to, get folks to open up about because that is probably the more embarrassing aspect. Like weird beliefs are one thing, but like having believed them and, having been unable to see it at the time is yeah, like a fairly big weight to carry in terms of getting folks to those thoughts. Again, I think there is this like self-blame and like negative exceptionalism. I don't know exactly what Keith was thinking there, if it was just a loyalty test to some degree, like he felt all powerful, he felt like he could um get anyone to sort of be on board with anything. There was a teaching within NXIVM that like if you resisted something, then that was disintegration, something that you had to work on, and so folks wouldn't want to rock the boat for fear of like getting more attention and accountability in them in the spotlight when you have already a pattern of doing that, of taking at face value anything Keith Raniere says, like you can accept like, okay, this thing sounds pretty out there, but I'm going to accept it because, it's coming from my teacher, because I don't want to resist. Resisting, would suggest some kind of problem on my end. I still struggle to wrap my head fully around it. I don't think it is for an outsider to really interpret, like you really do have to be in the hot water with the frogs to understand.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So it's as if, like, if you disagree with anything that the leader is saying, you're so shamed and made to feel embarrassed that it's easier, I think, to just go along with it to a point where maybe you even start believing it because you've been told this thing over and over again. What I think is interesting with Twin Flames universe is like with Nexium, there were no videos that I saw at least that showed this in action. But with the Twin Flames universe, like there are videos of Jeff basically bullying people into believing that this person is their twin flame. And I'm forgetting like the younger sister who is brought into it by her older sister, and you can see her up on stage at one point, and you have the advantage of knowing now that that relationship was awful. But with that insight, you're looking at this couple, and she was like 19 years old, and you could see how afraid and scared she was to disagree with Jeff. So she just sat there and nodded and went along, and everybody else is applauding. So you're like, okay, this must be the way it goes, you know? And then
Yeah.
you said too about the isolation component, like they isolate you intentionally to keep you from other people who have ideas that might contradict what they're teaching you. But I'm curious with people that you have spoken to, people who have come out of the cult. There are a lot of these people who are really close with their families before they got sucked into this cult. How difficult is of a decision is that for people to cut off their families?
Yeah, so that was my entry point to the Twin Flames universe story is I got contacted by one of the moms and I really wanted to explore that aspect because yeah, they were very close with their families. Some of them, some of them were twins, right? You see in the documentary, inseparable for their entire lives. And then because the family questioned the beliefs of the group, they end up being cut off and cut off in this very formal way, like through a letter that says like I've been doing spiritual work, our values no longer align, very much using the language of the group to suddenly, cut off contact. Although sending money seemed to help rekindle contact with the family. So that was an aspect that also intrigued me. But family relationships are complicated. Like, I do not know if my relationship with my mom could survive these kinds of intense, like, oh, does your mom really have your best interests in mind? Like, who could answer that? Like, I mean, of course, my mom does have my
Yes.
best interest
Right.
in mind. She's the best. But it's like these are complex relationships and there are always vulnerabilities and weak points. And that was the case with a lot of these families is there was something there to exploit. Unfortunately, in some of the cases, gender identity was that, trigger point. And I certainly do believe that at least some of those folks in that group did genuinely come to um a particular, identity. But I think it's fairly well demonstrated, I think, in the documentaries that some of them that was not their intention, that was not coming from within them, and they didn't seem to have a choice in the matter. So, add a complicated relationship where, you know, and this is actually as old as time. Cults always end up like changing people's names and identities. Like that's classic in a sense. The gender aspect is a little bit newer. But so to have a family that's like, we know you by this name, can just be this force for separation. And so, yeah, it's a very complicated, very nuanced situation. I think both documentaries did a good job of handling those very delicate aspects.
Yeah, no, I think that they both showed that really well. And it was just heartbreaking to see a lot of those parents just struggle for years because they had no way of communicating or connecting with their children. So Very sad. And something too that we talked about a little earlier was some of the punishments could be physical or mental, but that also started stripping away at people's ability to think for themselves or right, like kind of trapped them in this cult. Nexium seemed like they had very intense punishments. Like this one child was kept in a room for 2 years because she decided that she had a crush on somebody else who wasn't Raniere. That was the reason, right? And
Yeah.
she, and she had no furniture in this room. Meals were delivered outside of her door, 3 times a day. Her entire other family lived in this house, but she was never allowed out. Interesting though, the door was not locked. Like she could have left, but the control that Raniere had over both the family that reinforced her staying in that room and herself making her stay in that room and not try and leave for a very long time just is evidence of this insane mental and physical control.
Yeah, I think that image is really powerful, just in terms of illustrating the extent of the Nexium system of control. The fact that the door was not locked, but there was no way that she could even imagine, even for a second, leaving that door until almost 2 years in, she finally started, you know, and the way she testified in court, like it really did illustrate, how those gears started turning, how it took her weeks, to even get there, how she had to let go of everything, like because so much was held over her head as a punishment, that she would lose her status in the country, that she would never be able to talk to her family ever again, that she was so close to. All these things she had to mentally let go of and say, that's fine. I will live, you know, illegally. I will find my way back to Mexico where, she had been born. I will never talk to my parents or sister or brother again. That was how badly she wanted to escape, right? Those were the things she was willing to give up for some semblance of freedom. So, like, that's a really intense, that's probably the most intense version
Mm,
of psychological manipulation
yeah.
that I've ever studied. All the power to her, Daniela, for overcoming it and being able to articulate it so well, because it was just absolutely heartbreaking to hear. And yeah, I just wish her all the healing in the world.
Yeah. So much strength of character that I don't know how many people would be able to have done that given that circumstance. So it's
Yeah.
pretty remarkable.
Well, and I think he saved the worst punishments for her because she had so much fortitude, It was, yeah, just out of this world, insane level of manipulation.
Well, I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like her text messages to him were published, and she would often push back on things that he was saying a little bit in a way that other people really didn't. And even that was shocking to think of a young girl, because at that time she was in her mid-teens kind of being like, I don't know if I agree with you, or I don't know. And he would get really upset. And so, yeah, she always was like a strong little minded person given how young she was.
Well, yeah, and that was Danielle's younger sister, Cami, whose
Oh,
texts got published. But yes, similar situation. That's the thing. And neither of them know this inner, relationship is happening with the other. Like they are kept
just
so isolated even from each other in those moments that they couldn't compare notes and be like, hey, he's doing this to both of us. But yeah, you can see flickers of it for sure. Um, there was just a lot of really unforgettable testimony and evidence in that case. It was a lot to try and illustrate for a reader because there were thousands of pages that I could have included, but only had room for a little bit of it.
so I'm curious then, like, how does this affect you as a journalist, a reporter? Like, you're really sitting in this for years and years as you're uncovering more and more really unfortunate things that are happening in these cults. Like, does that affect your mental state? Because I got to be honest, even when I was reading your book, I was really, I mean, I had nightmares. I was like, this is really intense, you know?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I got overwhelmed so many different times, during the trial, like the end stages of edits, and when it came out and I was doing, a lot of interviews and, trying to answer a lot of hard to answer questions. It did weigh on me. It always does, especially hearing from folks after the fact, actually after the Twin Flames universe talk, a lot of folks in a lot of different sort of abusive situations reached out to me. It's heartening to know that like they felt seen or cared for in some way. But of course, it's just too much information uh, to take in. It's overwhelming. It does affect my sleep, my ability to function in society sometimes. And that is why, my more recent projects have been nothing to do with cults, the Olympics, sports, and stuff
Break.
like that.
A little
Like just,
break. A little break.
yeah, just trying to be, yeah, just keep a mix of things because it is a dark rabbit hole to be down for too long of a time.
Can you talk about how sometimes like investigating this so deeply kind of affected or compromised your own personal safety? Like I would imagine like knowing how intense these cults are, if someone's like digging for the truth, Jeff isn't going to like that. Like Keith Raniere is not going to like that. So did you ever kind of deal with that? And was it scary?
Yeah, yeah. So I certainly still to this day deal with a certain low level paranoia. I do write about it in the book, because I mean, yeah, these groups, Keith Raniere in particular, was all about surveillance, all about collecting information on everyone, close confidants, enemies, you name it, like powerful people. That was his MO. And so, of course, you start to think and speculate because, of course, all it can be is speculation. You can never confirm these sort of gut feelings. You start to speculate who has recently introduced themselves to me out of the blue, and said they had information. It's not a good mental state to be in, to be honest. But if you talk about it openly, you get your speculations out, you say, it's probably not the case. I'm probably not being spied on, by vengeful cult leader. It's probably not happening. You can talk yourself out of those headspaces, but it's not easy. And some of it is fair, I think. I think the particular instance that I include in the book, it's like, it's on the line. What can I say? This is my experience and I'm free to share it. And I hope that by sharing it, I don't send people down a rabbit hole, but realize, help people realize that these groups are big and intimidating, and it's not easy to come forward about them.
No, I think that the work that you do is so important because just so many people are trapped in these cults. And I think that raising awareness and the more that we talk about it, I think that this is just planting stuff in people's minds of like red flags to be aware of. Really fast before we wrap up, because I just have one last question for you, because something that was so moving to me is the dedication of your book.
Mm.
So you dedicate your book to women who change their minds. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So in the case of NXIVM, women were never allowed to change their minds. They had to pledge their loyalty to Keith Raniere for all eternity. If they went against his word at any point, that would be seen as, their problem, a flaw within them, and that is what keeps the NXIVM machine whirring along. That's what freedom is, though, is I get to take in new information. I get to, read a lot of sources, talk to a lot of people, and come to a different conclusion. It's the best. Like literally, even just me exploring these topics, I get to change my opinion of things as I get new information. Like, and that's so normal. And like not everyone feels that way. Some people think that they have to be loyal no matter what. And I just hope that, yeah, I just wish more freedom for those people. That's kind of the thinking behind it. Um, yeah, and thankfully, like in the 5 years since, the NXIVM story broke, a lot of the loyalists who really stuck to Kieth Raniere, for years, they have come around, they have separated themselves from the kind of trap aspects and are, coming into their own. So that is very, very heartening to see. I love to see that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I just again wish them all the healing in the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. This was so enlightening and you're just so cool. And I just admire your work so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. I had a blast talking about this stuff. Thanks again for having me. Yeah.